What if I told you the quietest people in your life are often the most dangerous to lose? Not because they will hurt you, but because once you break their emotional trust, they don't argue, they don't beg, they don't warn you. They simply vanish from your emotional world as if you never mattered. And the strange part is, you won't even realize when it happens. Because for an empath, leaving is never loud. It is silent, slow, and final. But behind that silence are very specific emotional triggers that decide everything. Think about this. Have you ever had someone who used to care deeply, listen fully, and show up for you, suddenly become distant without explanation? No fight, no closure, just absence. Most people misread this as mood or change.
But for an empath, this shift has a pattern. And if you understand these patterns, you will understand exactly why they walk away forever. There's a quiet strength in empaths that most people often overlook. They carry an emotional depth that allows them to love intensely, give without hesitation, and recognize goodness even when it is buried under pain or confusion. Their perception goes beyond surface behavior. They feel what others ignore. But the reality many empaths discover only after repeated experiences is this. When they are pushed beyond their emotional limits, they don't create drama or demand explanations. Instead, they quietly withdraw, not because they are weak, but because they have finally chosen themselves after giving too much of themselves to others who did not fully value it. Empaths are naturally giving individuals. Their kindness is not strategic, and it is never offered with hidden expectations. They show up with emotional support, time, patience, and understanding, often at moments when others feel most lost or overwhelmed. They notice what others miss, such as subtle changes in tone, unspoken stress, and silent emotional struggles.
This awareness makes them incredibly comforting to be around. However, over time, this same quality can become emotionally draining for them when it is not appreciated or reciprocated. What begins as natural generosity slowly turns into emotional weight when their efforts are taken for granted. At the beginning, an empath rarely complains or pulls back. They tend to understand that everyone goes through difficult phases in life, and they are often the first ones to offer patience instead of judgment. They listen longer than most people, forgive more easily, and give second chances even when others would walk away. However, there is a subtle but important difference between being supportive and being consistently overlooked. Over time, empaths begin to recognize when their kindness is no longer being valued, but instead expected as a constant. This realization does not come all at once, but gradually through repeated emotional experiences.
It often begins in very small ways that are easy to ignore at first. Messages go unanswered more frequently. Efforts are not acknowledged or appreciated. Acts of care that were once noticed become something others simply expect without gratitude. The shift is quiet but powerful. The empath continues to show up, continues to care, and continues to give, but internally something begins to shift. They start noticing emotional imbalance. While they are investing deeply into the connection, they receive very little emotional return. It is not about keeping score for them, but about feeling emotionally seen and valued in return. Being taken for granted creates a form of exhaustion that is difficult to explain. It is not loud or dramatic. It builds slowly inside their emotional world. Each unappreciated effort adds to an invisible emotional weight that they carry without complaint. Because empaths feel everything deeply, this weight does not remain just a thought.
It settles into their emotions and affects how they experience the relationship. Over time, they begin to question their place in the other person's life. They wonder if they are genuinely valued or simply available when needed. This quiet questioning changes their emotional connection in a profound way. What makes this process even more significant is that empaths rarely express these feelings immediately. They do not rush into confrontation or emotional arguments. Instead, they observe carefully and try to understand the situation from all sides. They often give space for improvement, hoping that things will naturally balance out again. In many cases, they even blame themselves first, thinking they might be expecting too much or misinterpreting the situation. This self-reflection can continue for a long time while they continue to give and support as they always have, without letting others see their internal struggle.
However, awareness eventually changes everything. Once an empath clearly recognizes that their kindness is being used rather than appreciated, their entire emotional perspective becomes sharper. They begin to withdraw their energy slowly and intentionally, not out of anger or revenge, but out of clarity and self-protection. They reduce overgiving, step back emotionally, and stop extending themselves in the same unrestricted way. To others, this shift may feel sudden or unexpected, but in reality, it has been building quietly within them for a long time before it becomes visible. It is important to understand that when empaths pull away, it is not a form of punishment. They are not trying to teach a lesson or create emotional consequences for others. Instead, they are protecting their inner emotional balance. Their ability to care deeply is one of their most valuable traits, and when it is repeatedly overlooked, they begin to realize that it must be protected. This moment often marks a turning point in their emotional growth.
They start becoming more selective with their energy, choosing carefully where and with whom they invest their emotional presence. Once an empath reaches this stage, it becomes very difficult to reverse their decision. The same person who once gave endlessly and without hesitation now becomes more distant and intentional. They no longer seek validation for their worth, nor do they try to prove their value through overgiving. Instead, they align their actions with self-respect. Their presence becomes calm, controlled, and no longer easily accessible. And when this shift happens, it is rarely dramatic or loud. It is quiet, steady, and often permanent, because it is rooted in emotional clarity rather than temporary reaction. Empaths also have a natural ability to sense what is not being said directly. They notice inconsistencies in behavior, changes in tone, and subtle emotional tension that others may overlook completely.
Even without clear evidence, they often feel when something is not right. However, despite this strong intuition, they usually do not react immediately. Instead, they give people the benefit of the doubt. They prefer understanding over accusation and trust over assumption, even when something deep inside them is signaling caution. When dishonesty enters a connection with an empath, its impact goes far beyond the words themselves. It creates emotional disconnection. Empaths value authenticity deeply because they themselves are honest in how they feel and express. They do not hide behind masks or manipulate situations for personal gain. Because of this, they naturally expect sincerity in return. When they sense deception, it does not just affect their trust in a single moment. It affects their emotional safety within the entire relationship. Something inside them begins to feel unstable. At first, they may try to ignore the feeling of dishonesty.
They might convince themselves it was a misunderstanding or a one-time mistake. Their nature pushes them toward empathy rather than judgment, so they try to understand possible reasons such as stress, fear, or human imperfection. They give space for truth to emerge naturally instead of forcing confrontation. However, this patience has limits. When dishonesty becomes repeated or consistent, it becomes impossible for them to ignore the pattern forming in front of them. Repeated dishonesty slowly breaks down trust. Each instance creates a small crack in the emotional foundation of the relationship. Over time, these cracks widen, and emotional security begins to fade. The empath starts questioning not just the specific situation, but the entire connection itself. If truth is not stable, nothing feels reliable anymore. Conversations lose their depth because doubt always lingers in the background.
Even genuine moments feel uncertain because the foundation of trust has been weakened. What hurts empaths the most in these situations is that they often sense the truth long before it is admitted. They notice the gaps in stories, the hesitation in words, and the mismatch between energy and speech. Even when they do not speak about it, they are aware, yet they wait, hoping honesty will come willingly without pressure. They want truth to be chosen freely, not forced out through confrontation. But when that honesty never fully arrives, their trust quietly begins to fade, and so does their emotional investment. When that response never comes, a quiet disappointment starts to form inside the empath. It is not only about the lie itself, but about the lost chance for honesty that could have kept trust alive. Over time, this feeling grows heavier with each repeated moment of dishonesty. The empath begins to shift internally. They detach in a very controlled and quiet way, not suddenly or emotionally explosive, but with intention.
They stop asking questions where the answers already feel obvious. They stop putting emotional energy into conversations that no longer feel sincere or meaningful to them. Their openness slowly starts to close. This emotional withdrawal is not driven by anger or revenge. It is shaped by self-protection and inner clarity. Once trust has been broken repeatedly, it does not return easily for an empath. For them, trust is not only about hearing truth in the present moment, but about feeling secure in it over time. Consistency is what builds belief, and repeated dishonesty weakens that foundation completely. Even when apologies are given or promises are made, the emotional certainty that once existed does not fully return. Eventually, the connection no longer feels emotionally safe, and the empath stops engaging in the same way as before. At this stage, the empath does not feel the need for confrontation or dramatic closure.
Instead, their withdrawal becomes quiet and steady. They reduce emotional investment, limit their presence, and step back from deeper involvement. Rather than staying in confusion or mixed signals, they choose clarity and emotional stability. This decision is not impulsive. It is the result of prolonged emotional observation and repeated disappointment. Once they reach this level of understanding, they stop trying to repair something that has consistently failed to remain stable. They accept that trust cannot be rebuilt alone. Empaths experience life through deep emotional perception. Their feelings are not shallow reactions that pass quickly. Instead, they process emotions fully and attach meaning to even small interactions. When they express how they feel, it comes from a place of sincerity and trust, not exaggeration. They are sharing something personal and meaningful from within themselves. Because of this emotional depth, the way others respond to their feelings plays a very important role in shaping the connection.
When their emotions are dismissed, it does not only hurt in that moment, it affects their sense of being understood. Phrases like, "you are too sensitive," or "you are overthinking," may seem small on the surface, but for an empath, they carry deeper emotional weight. These responses do not just dismiss a feeling, they indirectly question how the empath naturally experiences the world. Instead of feeling heard, they begin to feel minimized. Instead of feeling accepted, they feel like something in them needs to be corrected or controlled. This creates an internal emotional conflict where they know their feelings are real, but are being told otherwise. At first, empaths try to explain themselves more clearly. They adjust their tone, soften their words, and sometimes even reduce the intensity of their emotions just to avoid conflict and maintain peace. Their goal is not to argue, but to connect and be understood.
They believe that better communication will lead to better understanding. However, when emotional dismissal becomes a repeated pattern, something changes inside them. They slowly begin to feel that their voice does not carry importance in the relationship anymore. This repeated invalidation gradually weakens their confidence in expressing themselves. Over time, it creates self-doubt, even though their emotional awareness is still strong. They may begin questioning whether they are overreacting or whether they should stay silent instead of speaking openly. This is where emotional damage becomes deeper because it slowly disconnects them from their natural emotional clarity. Instead of trusting their feelings, they begin to second-guess them. As this continues, the empath starts to hold things inside. It is not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that expressing themselves does not lead to understanding. Conversations that once felt open and emotionally meaningful start to become surface level.
Their emotional openness fades and is replaced by caution. They become more guarded in how they share themselves, and emotional distance slowly begins to form. What is often misunderstood is that empaths do not expect everyone to perfectly understand their emotions. They are aware that their emotional depth is not always easy for others to process. However, what they deeply need is respect. Respect means listening without judgment, acknowledging feelings without dismissing them, and allowing space for emotions without trying to silence or correct them immediately. When this respect is missing, the emotional foundation of the relationship begins to weaken. Eventually, the empath comes to a clear realization that being in an environment where their emotions are constantly dismissed is not sustainable. It does not drain them because they are overly emotional, but because they are not receiving the same care and understanding that they consistently give to others.
This understanding does not appear suddenly. It develops slowly through repeated emotional experiences where they felt unheard or misunderstood. Once this awareness becomes strong, their behavior naturally changes. They stop seeking validation from those who continuously dismiss their feelings. They no longer feel the need to prove that what they feel is valid. Instead, they begin to protect their emotional space. Their silence becomes more noticeable, their availability decreases, and their emotional attachment begins to loosen. At this point, the relationship no longer feels supportive or emotionally safe. Without emotional respect, there is very little left to sustain a meaningful connection. So instead of continuing to invest in an environment where they feel emotionally reduced, the empath chooses distance. This is not an emotional reaction or an attempt to punish anyone.
It is a decision based on self-respect and emotional preservation, where they finally prioritize their own inner stability over maintaining one-sided emotional effort. Empaths naturally take on the role of emotional support in relationships. They listen carefully, comfort others without hesitation, and give their time and energy freely whenever needed. This is not something they force, it is part of their emotional nature. They notice when someone is struggling and respond with genuine care. However, when this pattern becomes one-sided, the emotional balance begins to break slowly. In many situations, the empath becomes the emotional center that others rely on. People turn to them during difficult moments, share their problems, and seek reassurance repeatedly. At first, the empath accepts this role willingly because it gives them a sense of meaning and connection. They also believe that this level of emotional support will naturally be returned when they need it.
However, when that expectation is not met, the imbalance becomes more noticeable over time. Gradually, the empath starts to realize that most conversations revolve around the other person's needs and emotions, while their own feelings are often ignored or quickly dismissed. This creates a situation where they are constantly giving emotional energy but rarely receiving it in return. Although they do not expect perfection, they do notice the absence of mutual effort and emotional balance. This kind of one-sided emotional exchange creates deep exhaustion over time. It is not only physical tiredness, but emotional depletion. Each interaction starts to require more energy than it restores. Even simple conversations begin to feel heavy because the emotional balance is missing. Empaths continue to invest deeply, so when that investment is not valued or returned, the emotional strain increases quietly.
One of the most complex parts of this experience is that empaths often stay longer than they should. They try to be patient, convincing themselves that the other person might be going through difficulties or that things will improve with time. They minimize their own emotional needs, believing that asking for more might be selfish. This mindset keeps them in an imbalanced cycle longer than is healthy for them. Eventually, awareness becomes unavoidable. They begin to clearly see the pattern. They are always the ones giving, always the ones understanding, and always the ones showing up emotionally. While they are capable of deep compassion, they also begin to recognize that relationships without mutual emotional effort cannot remain stable or fulfilling in the long run. As this clarity grows stronger, their behavior naturally shifts. They become less immediately available, not because of resentment, but because of necessity.
They no longer respond instantly to every emotional demand. They start taking time for themselves and quietly limiting how much energy they give away. This change is not announced or explained. It happens gradually through consistent action. To others, this shift may seem sudden or confusing, especially if they were used to constant emotional availability from the empath. However, in reality, this change has been developing slowly over time through repeated imbalance and emotional fatigue. It represents the point where the empath finally begins to protect their own emotional well-being instead of continuously sacrificing it for others. The empath is not trying to punish anyone or create emotional consequences for others. Their withdrawal is not about revenge or proving a point. It is simply a form of correction, a way of restoring balance after prolonged emotional exhaustion. When they begin to pull back, they slowly redirect their attention and energy toward spaces where they feel valued and emotionally safe.
They start noticing the difference between connections that drain them and connections that feel mutual. Over time, they naturally move closer to relationships where care is not one-sided, where support is shared instead of constantly given in only one direction. This shift changes how empaths see themselves and their emotional energy. They begin to understand that what they feel and give is valuable, not something to be endlessly drained without care or appreciation. Once they experience emotional exhaustion deeply, they rarely return to the same patterns that caused it. They become more intentional with their time, more careful about where they invest their energy, and more observant of who genuinely respects them versus who only takes without giving anything meaningful in return. Their awareness of emotional balance becomes much sharper, and their tolerance for imbalance naturally decreases. At this stage, their entire approach to relationships transforms.
They no longer respond to one-sided connections with patience that has no limits or silence that ignores their own needs. If a relationship continues to take more than it gives, they do not argue or chase validation. Instead, they simply step away in a calm and grounded way. Their self-respect becomes stronger than emotional attachment. Trust for them remains deeply important and is built slowly through honesty and consistency. But once it is broken, it reshapes how they see the entire connection. Even when they try to forgive, a sense of caution remains, and repeated disappointment eventually leads them to withdraw quietly, choosing emotional safety over uncertainty and learning to protect their peace, even if it means letting go. In the end, the story of an empath is not about distance or coldness, but about learning balance. They begin with open hearts, giving understanding, patience, and care without hesitation.
But through experience, they also learn that emotional energy is not limitless, and that respect, honesty, and consistency are essential for any meaningful connection to survive. When those elements are missing, they slowly step back, not out of anger, but out of awareness. Their silence is not emptiness, it is protection, reflection, and a way of restoring inner balance. Ultimately, empaths grow into a deeper understanding of themselves and their emotional boundaries. They stop staying in spaces where they feel drained and start choosing connections that are mutual, steady, and respectful. This does not make them less caring, it makes their care more conscious and intentional. And in that growth, they learn one important truth. Real connection does not require self-loss. It requires balance, respect, and emotional safety for both sides.